Hey everyone, and welcome to our online event tonight. I'm Josh. I'm a new face here. I'm the one balancing out the craziness between these two other ones. Welcome. Skulk will do a brief introduction just now. Welcome. We're FEDSA, or we are participants from FEDSA. FEDSA is actually a community driven by all the front-end developers that are part of our community. We have some really cool upcoming events that I'd like to share with you. I don't have a slide to show you, so I'm just going to tell you, and I'll post the links in the chat. We have a ZAPT talk, ZA Product Design talk, happening on Monday, the 27th of February, and it is done by Gideon Carstens, a really cool guy and also a great product designer. He'll be talking about imposter syndrome, and I think that's something that a lot of us face, especially in this changing world we're in at the moment. And then we have a very cool opportunity for all the front-end developers out there. We're having a free workshop next Saturday on the 4th of March, happening in Cape Town, and Mr. Skulkventer here will be hosting it. It will be, the topic will be JavaScript for beginners, and we're aiming to just equip people with some basic JavaScript knowledge to get started in this language. So if you're trying to learn it, if you're new to the industry, even if you're not a developer but you want to understand JavaScript a bit better, maybe you're a manager, please join us. It is quite vital that you RSVP on our meetup event so that we can just have an idea how many peanuts to buy as snacks. Yeah, so that would be it from me. I'm going to hand over to Skulk to introduce Justin.
Yeah, so that's 1 peanut per person. Maybe 3 if you contribute a lot during the day. I think the mentors can get 3 or 2. The rest of you guys are getting a single peanut. All right. So what a way to start a talk. It's always an interesting experience introducing Justin. I'm pretty sure it's equally interesting for him introducing me. So both of us have been doing front-end development South Africa, even before this when it was Cape Town front-end developers. And so this isn't the first time I'm introducing him. So I've done a couple. He's also done a couple. So I think I'll try and keep it concise and maybe just say that Justin is kind of hands down my go-to CSS person. If I have any really nuanced questions about CSS, around the box model, around the specification, sure, I have and I nerd out on the specification quite hard. And I don't think I've ever met someone who nerds out as hard on the CSS specification as Justin does. So I know a couple of people that really nerd out on kind of the JavaScript specification and so forth, but sure, man, this guy knows like his CSS through and through. So I guess I can't think of anyone more suited to actually talk about some of the new CSS selectors that have landed. Very interesting stuff, very interesting times. We're kind of, I guess, moving into what Jen Simmons would call kind of the world of kind of intrinsic layout and kind of intrinsic styling and so forth, meaning that your CSS selectors are going to start looking more and more like pattern matching instead of like your classic like class, just like class styling. So yeah, like as mentioned, I can't imagine anyone more suited to introduce it. So it's also worth noting, just maybe giving a quick shout out to our sponsors, which is NML, the company that Justin works for. They've been kind of sponsoring us for a very, very long time. And also IO Digital, who's also been kind of sponsoring us for a very, very long time. And they kind of also drive a ton of the product design stuff that we do. And then there are other sponsors as well, like Code Capsules, who sponsors the workshops. So for example, the one that we are going to do not this weekend, the one after that, and then also just Operativa, which kind of is more involved in kind of the React and TypeScript side of things, not necessarily the general front-end talks. Yeah, I think I've covered everything. Justin, I'm happy for you to maybe kind of flesh that out a bit more, kind of tell us a bit more about like who you are and why are you doing a talk on level 4 CSS selectors. Cool. So I'm happy to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, Skulk. Yeah, before I start sharing screens and doing slides and whatnot, yeah, I think that's a good question. Why level 4 selectors? If anyone's familiar with the way the CSS works, like the proposals come in from all over the place, they get evaluated, and if they're deemed to be something that A, can be agreed on, and B, would be a useful thing to have, then the specs are fleshed out, and eventually they go over to the browser makers who then implement them. And as we know, they don't all implement them at the same time, so we might have some things that are supported at some point, but not in some browsers, but not in others. And CSS Selectors 4 have been a proposal for a very, very long time, and has only now, really, in terms of the really, really powerful selector we have in this, which is has, being something that we can use in all our browsers. I say that that's not entirely true, but within a couple of days, it will be in Firefox, which is the last browser to support it, as currently under a flag. So I've always found CSS selectors really, really fascinating. I may be the only person in the world, because it really is the building block of how we write CSS. And selectors level 1, that would be, that's selecting a tag, selecting a class, selecting an ID. Selectors level 2 introduces things like attributes. Selectors level 3 introduces lists, and now selectors level 4 introduces a whole bunch of new pseudo-classes that allows us to do some really, really powerful selections. And as Scott mentioned, pattern matching. So some things that we could only have done in JavaScript before, we can now do just in CSS. Right. So I'm just going to pop my screen up. There's going to be like a weird infinite loop for a second until I get to my slides. I'm going to go through some slides just explaining what these new selectors are, how they work, where we should use them, and then we'll look at some actual real-world examples on how we can apply them. Okay, so what's new in CSS Selectors Level 4? Right, so there are 4 things I want to cover here, and that's not, is, where, and has. And we're going to start with not. Now, this might be one that people are familiar with because we've been able to use this for quite a while. And the not CSS pseudo class represents elements that literally do not match a list of selectors. And since this prevents specific items from being selectors, it's commonly referred to as the negation pseudo class. So not requires a comma-separated list or of one or more selectors as its argument. So we can select one item or many within that. And we can't chain the knots. So which makes absolute sense because a knot would cancel out another knot. Right. So some things that we need to bear in mind when we're dealing with not. For example, not star is a useless selector because that's going to select any element which is not an element, which is obviously nonsense. That makes no sense at all. And an accompanying rule will never, ever, ever be applied. So with many selectors, we can use our star, which selects all elements. Using that within not is just a waste of time. Nothing's going to happen. We need to bear in mind that when we write not.class, referring to any class, that will match anything that is not that specific class. So we need to be quite careful how we use these, because that will also include our HTML and body tags, for example. So not, and then whatever's in that will match anything that is not that. If we have something like body, so we're saying look inside our body, And then anything that is not in a table, but is a link, becomes problematic, because this will still apply to links inside a table, since tr, tbody, th, td, caption, etc. can all match not table part of the selector. So we need to be very careful when we're using not, that we aren't being underly specific. Yeah, we need to be quite specific with that. Not table does not refer to not table cell or table row or table header or table caption. So this is not going to work for us. So again, we need to be careful when we're using that. With not, if any selector is invalid, the whole rule is invalid. So a lot of things in CSS are forgiving. That is, CSS will pass over something in a selector list that is not valid if parts of it are valid. That is not the case with not. If any selector is invalid, the whole rule is invalid. For example, if we go not, and then we have a class, .foo, that's absolutely fine. But then if we try and stick in a pseudo class or pseudo element in there, colon banana, that does not exist. And this will invalidate a whole rule. So we need to be very careful about that. If we're chaining things, if only one of them needs to be invalid to invalidate the entire rule. So not is not, as I say, forgiving. But selectors can be changed. So for example, you can do not and then foo, comma, bar, and that is now going to look at anything that is not foo and is not bar. So equivalent to not foo, not bar. Again, if any of those are invalid, the whole rule is invalid. Again, not foo, banana will invalidate a whole rule. Okay, so just to recap that, not negation pseudo class, we're looking at things that do not fit this particular rule, but we need to be careful when we use it, that nested elements, it may not apply, and that if we have one invalid element, it's going to be invalid. So the next two I want to look at are is and where, and I've put these together because they're quite similar. The only place where they really differ is in specificity. So is and where, pseudo class functions take a selector list as an argument, and it selects any element that can be selected by one of the selectors in that list. And the main difference is that where always has 0 specificity, whereas is will take on the specificity of the most specific selector in its arguments. So our most specific selector we can have in CSS is an ID. And if we're using where, and then we have an ID in that, its specificity is still going to be 0. So that's something we need to bear in mind. Whereas with is, if we have is and then an ID in that, that's going to take on the specificity of that ID. So that's going to be incredibly specific, as opposed to where, which will always be 0. These are very useful for writing large selectors in a more compact form. But I've been thinking a lot about where and where it might be useful. And I'm not finding many use cases, to be honest, except when we are looking at things like resets. And they can be very, very useful and valuable in a reset. Whereas is a lot more valuable, to my mind, because of the specificity we can attach to it. Right, so whereas not, if one thing is invalid, everything is invalid. The specification defines is and where differently, and as a forgiving selector list, okay, which means the opposite of that. But let's say we have an article and we want to apply some styles into that article. We might normally just write it as in the first code block there. If we want to use is, the notation is colon is parentheses and then the element we want to target within that. Okay, now let's think of a use case where we might have articles, sections, and asides, and within those we have heading tags 1 to 6, H1 to H6, and we want the font weight of all of those to be 600. In other words, we want them to be bold. And we could do that with a class. and that has become a fairly standard way of doing things. But if we look at the cascade and we look at inheritance, a way we might do that is like this: article H1, article H2, etc., 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 section, etc., aside, etc., font weight 600. And there we've got a whole lot of declarations there just to change that font weight to 600. Now, is allows us to compact all of these and put them into just one line. Okay, so I can change this, and I can say rather, is this an article, a section, or an aside? And then we've got a space, and we know that now we have a descendant selector in CSS. So we can then say is, and we can list all our H values, H through 6, change the font weight to 600. So here we're saying any one of those H1 to 6 that appears inside either an article, a section, or an aside, change the font weight to 600. And this is a much more elegant and easier way of writing this aforementioned one. And we are still maintaining a nice and easy to update bit of CSS there. Where would work exactly the same. We would just write here where we have is, we would write where. But remember that specificity will not apply. So if after this we change a font weight to 400 and we've used where, the font weight will now be 400 and not 600. When we're using is, we will have the specificity of a descendant selector. So we'll have the same specificity as if we had gone article H1, font weight 600. Okay, so that's not is and where, and we'll go through some examples of that and look at how we can use them. But the seriously powerful selector that we now have access to in level 4 is, in fact, has. So the functional has.
Can I quickly interrupt you before you get into that, Justin?
Please do.
So there is a question by Harold, and I think it's going to help clear some things up for those kind of following along. Is so he specifically asks, what is zero specificity? So it might be worth just taking a moment to explain specifically what specificity is, and what zero specificity specifically means.
Right. Thanks, Doc. Okay, so in CSS, we have different levels of specificity. Right at the top, the most specific thing we can do in CSS is to target an ID. So if we have an ID in our HTML, and we then target that in our CSS with a hash, that has a very, very, very high specificity. In fact, it has a specificity of 100. After that, we have classes and attributes. So a class or a data attribute or an input type, for example, type equals text, something like that. That's the next highest level of specificity, and those have a specificity of 1. After that, we then have our HTML elements. So article P, LI. Now I can't think of any HTML elements. Section, aside, div. Embarrassing. Those have a specificity of 0, right? So that's how specificity is calculated. So if you have, let's say you have a CSS declaration and you have an ID. Let me put it another way. Let's say you've got a div. Your div has an ID of foo. It has a class of bar. If in your CSS you go hash foo.bar, that has a specificity of 101 because you've got an ID and a class that you're chaining together. Extremely high specificity. Okay. So where acts just like a tag, okay, in that it does not have that level of specificity. A class will always overwrite just a tag. If you have a P and you say P class equals foo, in your CSS you write P font color blue. But then after that you write dot foo font color green, that's going to overwrite the P. If you put it before that, it's also going to overwrite the P, even if you change the order in the cascade, because that element will have a specificity of 0. So when we are saying where, no matter what we put in that where, it's always going to revert back to a specificity of 0. In other words, it will be treated the same as just a normal HTML tag in terms of its specificity. Does that answer the question?
So I also just quickly shared a link to MDN's article on specificity. But yeah, like I think that's a good summary. So you can think about specificity almost as determining. So if you've used the important override, so that kind of increases the specificity of something. So
Yes.
Specificity is the order that CSS determines what is the actual style that's going to be applied. So
That's right.
yeah, there's a lot of reading. I'd actually recommend like Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry. He actually writes quite a lot on specificity and managing specificity and so forth. So you can almost think about it like a Z index as well, you know. So it kind of it layers things, and like whatever is the highest is the final one. In the same way with Z index, if you do like 9,000, then that's going to override 3 or 5 or 100 and so forth. Yeah. Cool.
There actually also some, just last one on this, there are actually some nice little tools online. I'll dig them out if I get a chance, where you can go and put in a CSS declaration and it'll tell you the specificity of it, which is quite a nice way. And it'll tell you how that's being applied, which is quite nice to get your head around. Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, specificity is, you know, there are two things to CSS. There's the cascade, as in the C, where something where that follows something is going to potentially overwrite what comes before, but only within the bounds of the specificity rules that are applied. Okay. All right. So has. So functional has a pseudo class. This represents an element if any of the relative selectors that are passed as an argument match at least one element when anchored against this element. That's a real mouthful. That's directly from the specification. I will explain what all those things mean. And this, for the first time, gives us a way of selecting a parent element or a previous sibling element, which we've never been able to do before in CSS. We've always had to resort to JavaScript for this. Like in the old days of jQuery, everyone was hauling up the dot parent or closest or sibling, whatever, whenever we were trying to do this back in the old days. Now you would, you know, try and get an element that is a parent and then apply something in JavaScript. CSS with has allows us to do this without having to resort to any JavaScript. Right, so what does this look like? So here's a simple example. We've got an H1, and then we've got has, and then within them we've got our parentheses, and then we've got plus P, and then we're saying apply margin bottom of 0. So here we're saying look for an H1 heading that has a paragraph immediately following the H1, and then apply this style. Okay. So does this H1 have a P tag directly after it? If it does, apply a margin bottom of 0 to the H1. And that plus there is the adjacent combinator, adjacent selector. Yeah. Okay, so that's a simple example. We'll look at this in more detail when we start looking at the examples, and you'll see exactly how we're applying these things. But the important thing here is we're saying, look inside, look at this particular element, and now go backwards. Yeah. And that's something we've never been able to do before. Right. Okay, so in terms of has, if it's not supported in a browser, then the entire selector block will fail. unless has is in a forgiving selector list. So remember, our is and where are forgiving selector lists. Our has is not. Okay, so we can actually go is, and then within our is or where, and within that have a has declaration. And again, I'll show some examples of this. Just like with not and not, you cannot nest has within another has, because it's a pseudo element. And remember that pseudo elements exist conditionally, right? Based on the styling of their ancestors. And if we're trying to query a has within a has, we can get a horrible kind of cyclic querying where we're reusing the same objects many, many times. And these objects then become interdependent and we get a mess. So within the selector, within the specification itself, this is clearly outlined on why you can't do this. Additionally, you can't use pseudo elements within has. So pseudo elements like before and after, or invalid or valid. No, that's not true. Let me go back. Before, after cannot be used within has, as they're just not valid anchors. So you can't go has dot foo : before. You can't say, does this have a pseudo element? That is not allowed. Okay. All right, so when we're writing has, we might do something like this. We'd have a selector as a class, and then we'd say, again, in the first example, does this selector have another class inside it? Yeah. Then do something. Does the selector have an ID inside it? Then do something. Does the selector have a div inside it? Then do something. All right. So we can also chain it. Okay, now this is not the same as has inside has. These are separate hases. Here we're saying, does the selector have a div? Does that div have a class? Does that div have a class? Does that div have an ID? Okay. And again, we'll get into examples of chainability. We can also start to combine elements. So this we could actually just write as the following. Does the selector has a div, a class, and ID? So we can combine them with comma-separated lists. We don't need to write them all out like that. And then there's flexibility within this as well. Here we can say, does it have a div? Does it have an accordion? Does it have a class? Does it have an ID? And even if we put something in there that doesn't exist, it's not going to fail because it is a forgiving selector list. If we were trying is or where here, this would fail. It would be invalid. With has, that is not the case. It is a forgiving selector list. So we can actually have something in there that might fail, and it's not going to break our entire bit of CSS. Okay, let's go and have a look at some examples. Unless, Skulk, there are any other questions at this stage?
So there is one from my side, just out of curiosity.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So just out of interest, because like focus within was like a massive deal maybe a year ago. So I'm curious whether has kind of reduces some of the benefit of something like focus within, and focus within effectively just becoming shorthand for something that you can effectively do with has as well. Or can you not use pseudo states in has?
You can use any pseudo class. You cannot use a pseudo element. So yeah.
Okay. Not a pseudo class. Yes. So
yes.
I can say, for example, this div, does it have a button that has a focus state inside it?
Yeah.
Or I can say effectively use the So I can effectively use also the universal selector to say, is anything focused inside this?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
And you can get even more specific. You can say, for example, if a button is focused inside this. So
Correct.
yeah, like which is So, and I guess that's kind of one of the drawbacks of incrementally developing a spec. Is that now we have an entire selector that not only is redundant, but is actually now less powerful than just doing the same thing with has. Yeah. Exactly. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, that is the case. You are absolutely right there. You can do. I've actually got an example with some inputs using valid and invalid, and how we can use has with those. Yeah.
And but this is the thing about the radical backwards compatibility. Now that's just how it's going to be. We can't go and say next version of CSS we no longer need focus within. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. I see this, while I have you here, there's another question by Luca saying, when chaining the class and the ID on the initial has div, why does the has ID not get chained onto the has.class?
Because they're not the same, You're looking for a class or an ID. You're not looking for class and. The comma is an or.
Okay. Yeah. So I assume then because I have some limited experience with has, but yeah, so I wasn't even aware that you could do kind of your classic like CSS operators within them.
No, you can, and you can use your adjacent. You can use adjacent combinators. You can use child combinator, etc., etc. You can use all of those.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So it kind of almost feels now CSS kind of needs mixins to a certain degree, because because people are going to start writing some really like complex selectors.
I know there are. There's a really interesting article by what's his name? Bram. I can't remember his surname. He writes loads of stuff about CSS, where he does some crazy stuff on selecting list items using has and nth child and nth type. Yeah. I've got an example of using nth of type in has that we'll get to later.
Yeah. Although I guess technically speaking, that wouldn't be a mixin, it would be a function to create a selector. But
no, you're right. Yeah.
At some point, I guess things are going to get so complex that maybe 2-3 years we'll need some type of like kind of function to actually create selectors for us. Okay, cool. I'll
actions here. We're doing like programmatic stuff, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And this is very interesting. And I don't want to diverge too much, but like this is like I did mention like kind of Jen Simmons and so forth, and like it's maybe a year ago we had the talk, maybe even 2 years ago, with Miriam Suzanne, and she started mentioning a lot of these things around like CSS is like getting a lot of functions. So it's always been this classic thing about HTML and CSS being declarative languages and JavaScript being imperative language. I guess it's still declarative, but like now things are starting to get a bit fuzzy. Especially with variables and all of that stuff.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thanks, Skulk. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. I'm going to start with is and where, and then we'll look at has in more detail, and then we'll do some combination stuff with has and not and all sorts of things. So if we look at what I've got here, I've got just a couple of headers. I've got just some divs headers, and then I've got some ordered lists. And you can see in these ordered lists, the first one doesn't have a class. The second one does, and the third one does, but those are different. And we're not applying any styles to them. The browser's just going to render this as an ordered list. I mean, see the first list, no class, list items, etc., etc. And then there's a paragraph at the bottom. We'll get to that. Okay, so as we can see, the browser automatically is adding our numbers to our list, because that's just the way ordered lists work. Okay. So now I'm just going to go and make a change to the CSS in my is and where list, and I'm going to say where, and I'm going to go OL. So what am I doing here? Okay, I'm saying where we have an ordered list, and now I'm going to use an attribute selector here, and I'm just going to say, what does this mean? So this means where an ordered list has a class, not do something. And what I'm going to say here is list style type none. Okay, so let's just break this down. We're saying where, we're using our where selector. We're saying if we've got an ordered list, does that ordered list have a class? Now, we don't need to specify what that class is. We're just saying, does that class exist? And this is our attribute selector, which is part of our CSS Selectors Level 3. So we've had this for a while. Now you'll see if I hover over this, it's telling me my specificity. It's 0, 0, 0. And the reason for that is because I am using where. I change this to is, and that should change. And there you see our specificity is now 0, 1, 0. And that is looking at our OL there. Oh, sorry, I said AI. I should say is, damn it. Okay. Our specificity is 0, 1, 1 because we've got our ordered list and our attribute selector. Okay, I want to go back to where here, and we're just going to go back here, and you'll see now we've got no list styles on these items. And that's because we're saying where we have a class, don't do any listing on that. Don't remove the list style type. Okay. If I say is, it's going to do exactly the same thing. Yeah, it's going to do exactly the same thing, but now we have specificity. Okay. So if I go where, okay, OL class, but now I go and I grab one of my classes. So I'm going to say second list style type, and we'll make a decimal. You'll see now that's overriding that. Okay, second list style type decimal has more specificity. Okay. And now we've got our decimal type there. If I change this to is, what's going to happen? Now it's gone, because our is has greater specificity than just a class. So, this isn't a real world example. This is just to show how where and is differ in terms of specificity. Okay. All right. Then I've got a header. I've got a header here with a paragraph in it, and here I'm just going to go and we're going to use is. Sorry, we're going to go header, so we know that, and we're going to go P. So there's a header inside a P, and we're going to say make it green. And now it's green. And let me just zoom in here. Okay, really basic CSS, like a descendant selector there, right? Okay, now we could make this a lot more specific. So we could say is header, sorry. I'm using the wrong notation, of course. Is, right? Is header. Then whenever you do this, you do it wrong, right? Is header. P, color, blue. Okay. So header P, color green. Is header P. Is there a P inside header? That's what we're saying. Does this header contain a P? What's my specificity? It's 2. What's my specificity? It's 2, so it's the same. But now it's blue. If I move this above this, what's going to happen? Okay, remember now we're making use of our cascade. It's going to be green. Okay. So this is no more specific than this. So again, you need to think, well, you know, I'm using this, I'm writing this. What's the best way to do it? Should I be going and writing a header, etc., etc., etc.? Where this becomes much more useful is if we have a header, and then we have a header with a class equals, I'll just call it class. No, I won't do that. Let's just call it test for want of a better way. Okay. If we look here, they should both be green, right? Because we've got our this coming here. But now, if we say is test P, now that's going to be blue. And now that becomes a lot more helpful because we might want to color on a paragraph if it's inside a specific element. We now just need to apply that class. Yeah. Whereas our header specifically is going to remain green. Okay, so that's some just quick examples of is and where. Has is, as I've said, where things start to become really powerful. So I'm just going to open this one, and you'll see here we've just got two divs. So we've got a div, and there's no paragraph in the first one, and we've got a div and a paragraph in the second one. Let's look at our HTML structure here, and you can see we've got that div, and then we've got another div. They both have the same class. The only difference is the second one has a paragraph. Okay. Okay, so these are both called example one. So we can go and target those, and then we can say has. Now, what do we want to say? We want to say, does it have a paragraph? And then we can say, let's give it a border. And we'll make the border 1px solid black. And let's give it some padding. And we'll make the padding 2 rem. So what are we doing here? We're saying, look for example, anything with a class of example one. And if it has a paragraph inside it, then apply these styles. And if we go back here, we'll see here now we've got, when we have a paragraph, we are applying padding and a border. And if we inspect this here, you can see here's our, oh, sorry, let me just zoom in here. You can see here in our inspector, we are seeing our border being applied, but not being applied to our previous example one because it doesn't have a paragraph. Now we can also do some inheritance here. So we can also go example one. Does it have a paragraph? Okay. Does it have an H1? If that is the case, make that H1 blue. And you can see now our H1 here has changed color, which is nice. Now we've gone and said, okay, let's distinguish these elements when they contain different content. Again, we could not have done this without JavaScript until very, very, very recently. Okay, simple examples. Let's look at something like a button. So I'm just going to get rid of this, and I'm just going to go and grab this. And here we've got buttons here. Okay, they're not strictly buttons, they're just A tags, but anyway. So what's the difference between them? So they both have a class, but the second one has got an SVG. Okay. And in our CSS, we've just got some basic stuff going on here, some simple styles. Right, so we've got those two elements, but you can see they both have the same class, but as soon as we add the SVG, we're starting to get into some layout problems. Yeah. And we can fix this as well with has. So if we look at our HTML again, we've got on our SVG, we've got a class called button icon. So we can use this in conjunction with our button class. So if we go back here and we go dot button, and then we say, does this button have an icon? And we can target that because we know it's called button icon. And then we can do some things. So the first thing we want to do is let's just change our display to inline flex. And that's already going to make a huge difference. And as you can see, we've got the icon is now already aligned nicely. And then we can just say, okay, also let's just align the item center. And you'll see now we've got a perfect button. So we're accommodating the fact that we've got a button and we are adding a icon to it, but we don't want to mess up the spacing, the sizing, etc. on that. And let's just add one more thing. Let's justify our content center as well, so we get some nice spacing. And there we go. So I mean, traditionally, the kind of way we might have done this, well, we would have gone class equals button, and then we might have said like button with icon or something like that. And then in our CSS, we would have gone and created an additional class. If we were using React, we would have had additional props, etc., etc., etc. But with has, we can do all of this in our CSS. We just need to declare one button with one button style. And then we can say, okay, does it have something else? And if it does, then let's go and do this kind of stuff. Okay, which is great. All right.
Can I maybe ask you to just zoom in a little bit more, just for anyone who's on a small screen?
On here.
Yeah. That should be great.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Scott. Okay, so I'm again going to get rid of this, and I've got something else here, and let me just grab that. Okay, right. So what have we got here? So we just got some cards here, laid out using CSS Grid, and you'll see there's one difference between them. Some of them have an image, and some of them don't. So if we look at what we're looking at here, I'm going to zoom out on this because that's better. Okay, so we've got some cards. They all have a title and a paragraph, but some of them have images and some of them don't. And then they're all styled the same, you know, border radius, box shadow, whatever. Okay, so if we look at this, we can say, okay, this looks fine when we have an image, but if we don't have an image, then our layout is not looking great. I just want to get this. Okay, there's our actual zoom, right? Okay. So what we want to do here is we want to look at the cards, and we're going to see, and we want to target which ones have an image and which ones don't. Okay, so if we look at our structure here, we've got a container called card grid. There's a nice containing element for us. Within that, we have a class of card link. And then when we have an image, we've got a class of card image. So I'm going to go back to my CSS here. Okay, this is just some basic stuff that sets up our grid, does some basic styling, etc. Nothing to worry about. What we're interested in is what we can do here with has. So I'm going to go card grid, because this is our container. And then I'm going to say, look in card grid for something with a class of card link, and then has. And here we're going to say, if we have a card image within that, so does our card link have a card image, then display it flex. Okay, and then align our items, center, and then add a gap. If you aren't aware, we can now use gap in Flexbox. And this is now going to change our things. So this is now much better, right? Now we're saying if we have an image, create a different layout property for this particular card. If we don't, just keep it that way. Yeah. And if we go and inspect this again, you can see here our card link is now displayed flex, align item center, gap 1 rem. Previously, it looked like that. Now we can say, okay, if it has an image, let's go and display it differently. Really nice. And then we can also now make use of our not here. So we can target our elements that don't have an image by going card grid, card link, not. And then in our not, we can go has. And now we can go card image. So let's just look at that. Here we're saying not. So our negation pseudo class, we're saying essentially this section here that we're using up here, we're saying, okay, good, but now add a chainable property to that and say if it's not that. So really this is just the opposite of this. We don't have to go and add all sorts of classes and things when they're different. And we'll just do something really simple here. Border top, 4px solid, Rebecca purple. And now we're distinguishing, again, visually, our cards that have different content without having to add many classes or different properties in our HTML markup or in JavaScript. And if we go and do all our responsive stuff, it all works out really nicely no matter how we're looking at it. Okay, so that's a really nice example of saying if this element contains certain content, then display it this way and apply various styles. If it doesn't if it doesn't contain this, then apply various styles. Okay, we're done with this one. I'm just going to get rid of it. I've got another grid here, a little bit more complicated than that one. So you can see here we've got a grid with a whole bunch of elements. Again, we're just using CSS grid to lay this out. But what we want to do here is we want to never have these go onto, we don't want these to go onto a new line, right? Okay. We just want one row, in other words. Okay. Now that's quite hard to do with CSS grid and keep things responsive. Yeah. So I'm just going to go back here again. If we look at this, we've got a wrapper, and then I'm just using card link and all that again. But we're going to add some different things here. This is where it gets complicated, okay? So we've got our wrapper, and we're going to say has again. Let me just add some space here. Okay, we've got our wrapper. We're going to say has. Does our wrapper have card link? It does. And then we're going to include something complicated here. So we're going to say nth last child. So that says go to the last child and then count backwards. And we're going to go n plus 5. Now here, we've specified an item size of 300 pixels. And we are using a variable for that. And you see in our grid template columns for our minimum, our min here, we are using that var of item size. So here we're saying match this. So, I mean, this is essentially the same as writing 300 pixels, right? But we're just referencing it as a variable. What we're doing here is we're saying, if there are more than 5, that's what this part does here. We're saying, if there are more than 5, make our item size, oops, (200 pixels). Right. I'm setting up my variable for size. It's 300 pixels. I'm using that in my grid columns as my min value. And then I'm saying, but if this wrapper has this div and there are more than 5, okay, change the size. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back, and you can see now we've got them all on one row. And if we go and inspect this, we're going to see that on our card link, sorry, on our wrapper, you'll see our item size is being overwritten because we have more than 5. So we've actually, in fact, got 6 here. If I go and remove one, you're going to see this is going to now change. Yeah. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to take one away, and I'm going to take another one away. Sorry, we have 7. And now you can see that when we've got 4, and this is actually now changing to our 300 pixels. I add it back, and you can see it changes now to our 200 pixels. So this is a really kind of complicated programmatic way of saying, how many items do I have? Count them. And if there's 5 or more, apply a smaller size, so we retain all these on one row. Now, this is kind of a contrived example. It's not necessarily something you're going to do in the real world, but I just wanted to use it to show how we can start to use things in has, like all our other selectors we have from levels 2, well, level 1, 2, and 3 within has. So this is another pseudo class we have using nth. So it could be nth, and we can use any kinds of combinations here. I could say nth of type, and just go to n, for example. And that's not working. Okay, never mind. Always when you try something on the fly, yeah. So we could start to use these things in combination with each other in order to do some real programmatic stuff within CSS itself. Okay, so as I said, that's kind of a contrived example, but just to demonstrate the power and possibilities of has. Okay, here's a more real-world kind of example. Let's say we have a bunch of context, and within that we've got headers, nice, and we've got images. And one of our images has a caption, or some of them might have a caption, some don't. Okay. If we look at this, we've got figure, and we've got a fig caption. Within that, with our image, here we've just got a figure with an image. We don't have a figure caption. We don't have a caption. So with this, we can start doing some interesting stuff again. We've got our header. So we can say, sorry, we've got our figure. We can say, does our figure have a fig caption? And this is particularly useful for like CMS generated content and things like that. And you can say, okay, does it have a caption? Let's give it a background color. Let's just make that white. Let's give it a box shadow. Why not? Do we make that? Let's go 0, 3, 10, 0. And we'll just make it. I'm just doing simple notation here. Oops. Okay, and let's give it some padding. And we'll just give it a padding of 1 rem, because why not? Here we're saying, okay, we've got a figure. Does this figure have a fig caption? If it does, let's style it differently, because we want that caption to be good looking. And there we go. So we've got a caption. When we're adding that, we are now styling our image differently. When we don't have a caption, our image is just appearing as it is. Okay. So again, there, the power of has. Does this exist? Now let's do something. Okay. Something else we can do to incorporate some nice things here is when we have, is in terms of typography. Scott knows how I go on about typography. This is just a simple example. I'm still working on some ways to use has, some more with typography. But here we've got a bunch of headers, right? We've got H1s, H2s, and H3s. We've got paragraphs, and there's some really nasty spacing that's going on here, right? We really don't like this. It looks really bad. So we can add some stuff using is for our typography. So we've got fig wrapper is our container, and we're just going to say is H1, H2, H3, and P, and we're going to say margin top 0. Okay, so here we're saying, are there any H1s, H2s, H3s, or paragraphs inside fig wrapper? Remember, this is a forgiving selector list. So if there aren't any H3s, it doesn't matter. It's not going to fail. Let's remove the top margins. So we do that. And now if we go and inspect this, and we can see, okay, there we go, margin top 0. I'll put it back, and you can see how it jumps. And if you look at that, you can see there's just a margin at the bottom of each of these elements. Yeah. Nice. We're already kind of on our way to improving the typography, but we've got this kind of
just before. Sorry, I just want to quickly interrupt you, Justin. You said the magic word typography. I need to head out.
Okay, thanks.
Just thought I'd let you know. Yushas should still be lurking in the background somewhere, so he might also help with some of the questions and so forth.
Okay.
But on my way out, I will leave you with this one. I see, like, this question was just asked.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So you can go ahead and take it from here.
Which question, Scott? I can't see the...
Okay, you're not seeing yours. Okay, let me maybe help with this one quickly. So with the addition of has, so this is from, I think it's pronounced Shadley. So he says, just a question, with the addition of has, not, and where, will the CSS curriculum change? I just started CSS later this year. Hopefully I only completed Scratch so far. So, okay, so I think this specifically just speaks to learning CSS in general.
Yeah.
How different do you see how do you see this would influence kind of learning CSS in 2023?
Okay.
Would it be dramatically different?
No, I don't think so. That's a great question. You know, we've written CSS fine up until now without these things. These make it a lot easier to do things. Yeah. There's nothing I've shown here tonight that you can't do with, your traditional BEM approach or whatever it might be. Yeah. But I think with a lot of CSS learning, with new stuff, you're not going to find it in a curriculum anyway. And if you want to learn it, you need to kind of dig around and find the articles and so on that are covering it, and then look at how it fits into your practice. Yeah.
Yeah. I would also say that these type of things usually, like, it's also like it tends to be more advanced use cases and so forth. So if you're building kind of like really modular CSS styling and so forth, so you might not even cover it in like kind of just an introduction to CSS and so forth.
Yeah,
I definitely see this more in the realm of like once you start creating like design systems and
yes,
stuff like that.
That's where it becomes very powerful.
Yeah. So in terms of basic CSS, introduction to CSS, like even if you don't understand anything that was just spoken about, like I don't think it's a big deal.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
This is far
cool. On that note, I need to head out. I will chat to everyone here hopefully soon again. Cool.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Cheers, guys.
Bye. Okay, right. So we've done that. That's fine. We removed the top margins. We already have a bit of a better thing, but we've still got some really nasty spacing that's going on. So we can use our is again to make some improvements to that. So again, we've got our container, and again, we can say is, and now we're going to say is, sorry, and we're going to say, is there an H1? Is there an H2? Is there an H3? And then we're going to say has. Okay. What we're going to say here, if we have an H1, H2, and H3, and we're going to use our adjacent sibling combinator, which is plus, right? We're going to say plus P. What that does is what we're saying here is, are there any H1s, H2s, and H3s that are followed by a paragraph? And if they are, then we're going to remove their bottom margin. And here we can see we've got, again, some vast, this is not finished by any means, but you can see here we've vastly improved the way the typography looks just by putting in that nice element. And we don't need to be adding classes and so on. Because here we're just saying, is it followed by a paragraph? Then apply this. So here we can see if we look at this one, our subheader, it has a margin bottom of 0. But our subheader doesn't because it's not followed by a paragraph. Okay. So we'd probably want to write some more CSS for that case when an H3 follows an H2 and so on and so on. I'm not going to get into all of that now, but there's some really nice ways we can start to use is, has, and combine them to really improve our typographic layouts. Right. I have one more thing and then I'm done, and that is to do with forms. So let me just open this one. Right. So here we've got a basic form. We've got a select an option, blah, blah, blah. And then you've seen this a million times. If you select other, then we want to show a text input. Yeah, now normally we'd write some JavaScript for that, and we'd say, what is the value of this option within the select? If it equals this, then show a text input. But using has, we can actually do this without having to write any JavaScript, which is great. So let's just have a look at the structure. So we've got a select here, and all of our options have values, as they should in valid HTML. And our last one has a value of other. Yeah. In following this, we've got a paragraph. It has a class of is hidden, and that's just putting it to display none. And then we've got a label, an input, etc., etc., etc. Right. There's pretty standard form stuff. Okay. So what we want to happen here is I select other, and that text input that is currently hidden, as you can see, here it is, will now appear. Okay. And as I said, we'd normally need JavaScript for this. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use our has, and we're going to go to our form, and we can say, okay, we've got a form. Now let's use has. Okay. And we're going to say, look at our options here. Okay. And in our form, we can see we've got an option and we've got a value of other. So we can use our attribute selector. So we can say, is the value of this other? remember to check your case. I just want to see if I'm doing this correctly. Yeah, and then we want to say, okay, so when we do something in the form for a drop down, and we select an option, it gets a pseudo class of checked. And that is just automatically added in HTML. So that's great. So now what we're doing here is we're saying, has someone selected that option with the value of other? And then what we want to do is we want to look for is hidden, right? Which is our paragraph. We remember following here that we're hiding. Then we just got a class somewhere here, is hidden display none. Yeah. So all we want to do there is we just want to say display block. Simple as that. Now, if I come here and I select my other, there's my input now showing. No JavaScript, just literally one CSS declaration that's allowing us to do that, because within has, we can check for other pseudo classes. Yeah. All right, if I go and I select a different one, you can see it disappears. So it's working exactly how it should work without having to write any JavaScript. Okay. And one last thing I just want to show that we can do here is, we have labels. So all form, we should always have a label for and matching an ID as we have here. Okay, that's just standard stuff. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say, does our label have something? And we're going to use our plus selector here again, because we've got our label, and then directly following that, we've got an input. So if we say plus, and then we say input, so that's saying, from our label, look for the input that directly follows it, and is that input valid, which is another pseudo class that we have. And then we're going to say label has, and we're going to do the same, plus input, valid. But here we're going to target our pseudo element after, and we're going to say make the color green. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're saying we've got a label. Does our label have an input directly following that is valid? If so, make the color green. Right. So we go to our option. We put in other. Mac zooming sometimes takes you by surprise. And now it won't let me zoom out, of course. Okay, no matter. I'm going to fill that in, and you can see my labels changing color. Yeah. Because my input is valid. There we go. Right. So I'm just going to type something in here, and you can see my label changes color. Go back. Again, we're just using CSS for that. Normally, we would need JavaScript. And then we're also going to add something else. So if we have a after element, we should have a content value for that. And I'm just going to put a Unicode tick in there, because why not? I mean, it's a terrible design, but it's just to show these things. So here we can go, and we're doing now essentially doing form validation within a CSS. Now, please note, this is not form validation. It is indicating whether you are entering correct elements or not. We could have another block for this for invalid, yeah, which could work exactly the same. Okay, so that's it. Any questions? Oh, I see no one could see my screen. Sorry, I didn't see that. Can you hear me now? Which part did you miss? Okay, sorry everyone. Seems like something went wrong there where Skulk left. I was just showing how we can use has with our forms. So I'll just go over this one quickly. Let me just comment those out. So if we've got a form and what we want to do here is select other, and if we select other, we want to show an input block to add that other. So what we can do here is we can, sorry. Here we've got a value of other, and we can go, does our option have a value of other, and is that checked? In other words, has that been selected? Then for our is hidden, just display it. Yeah. So if I go here and I go, I'm just going to refresh here, and I go other. There, I'm showing my input just using CSS, no JavaScript required. And then we can also add some things because we can say, do we have a valid input? And if we do have a valid input, then do some additional styling on that. And you'll see if I start typing in here, it's going to change to green and show that tick. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I'll post all these code examples up on GitHub, and then we'll share them in the links on ZATech. Apologies, I think when Skulk left, he must have removed my screen for some reason. But yeah, are there any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, yeah, sorry about that glitch at the end. As I say, I'll post this all up on GitHub so everyone can just grab the code and you can play around with it and see how it works within the examples. Yeah, so yeah, I'm all alone here. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, the recording will be up tomorrow morning. We'll share it again with the various links. And yeah, if you want to join us next Saturday at the Waterfront for that free JavaScript Introduction to JavaScript workshop, please sign up on Meetup. Okay, thanks all.